Good evening, everyone. This is, I know, not the typical format you are used to seeing this. As it turns out, our recording on Wednesday night did not go as planned. So what you see here before you is a bit of a makeup. Trying to make sure that you as viewers have access to lesson number 25. It satisfies my need to have the complete set of Ezekiel classes on YouTube. And I know there was at least a couple of instances of, or at least one instance of someone actually asking if this was going to be recorded. And I assured them, yes, these things are on YouTube, with the exception of this one. So we're going to try to alleviate that problem here and now. That's why you notice we're in a bit of a different environment than our standard Wednesday night Bible class. But Lord willing, we'll be able to provide some things in this video that would be very helpful to you in your study of Ezekiel. I hope the study's going really, really well. If you have a chance to study with us on Wednesday night in person, that is exactly the best place to get the content that we share with one another in terms of being able to study the Bible and draw from it the things God wants us to know. This evening, as it is evening here, we are in Ezekiel 34. And this will be a little different than your standard the videos that have been coming, because I'm going to give you a few moments during the video to, if you haven't been reading or studying along with us, pause, take a moment, see if you can read through the text and kind of lead you not only through the text, but through the method we use to study it, which is hopefully will be helpful to you as well. But enough preview stuff. Here we are in Ezekiel 34. This is where the very famous section in Ezekiel referring to God as a shepherd for his people is found. Perhaps you're familiar with Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, right? That wonderful psalm begins, and the first four verses of that really show God acting as a shepherd for his people, leading them, you might remember, through the valley of the shadow of death. In a sense, that's where Ezekiel's audience is. They're in this, lonesome valley. They're in this valley of the shadow of death. Ezekiel's listeners are in Babylonian exile. They are a very long way from home in a foreign land, of course, there because of their sins against God. They have corrupted themselves with idolatry and other things, and God, fulfilling his covenant promises, as he always does, has subjected them to exile. In this wonderful chapter of Ezekiel, you find God really being portrayed kind of as you see the picture there on the right. Israel is muddy, they're stuck, they're woefully malnourished, they're on the edge of death. And yet God comes as the deliverer. He comes as the savior and says no less than a dozen times that he would be the shepherd of my sheep, as he calls Israel. And that's where our text leads us this evening. This is in the section of Ezekiel, and if you haven't been following this, okay, I explained the Neapolitan ice cream thing a few weeks ago, so you have to go back and find that. This is where the book kind of breaks down into three basic sections. You have your introductory sorts of conscription sections in 1 through 3. 4 through 24, the announcements of judgment against Judah and Jerusalem. 25 through 32 are the messages of judgment against Israel's neighbors, Judah's neighbors. But then in 33 and following, you have these announcements of salvation for Israel. Now, there are still judgment sections in this. But instead of judgments against Israel as a whole, as we're going to see tonight, it's more of judgments against their enemies mixed in with messages of salvation. And 34, of course, would be within this last section. What I'm going to do right now, and this is not something I would do during our class time, because that is where I presume that everyone has had their chance to sort of study and look at the text and absorb it and gather from it the things that they would want. But I'm going to take a moment to let you pause the video. And during this pause, if you're studying along with us, read through the section, chapter 34, not that many verses. Read through the text. And as you're reading through, address the sorts of questions that you can see or at least partially see there on your screen. What do you see in the text itself? What sorts of things catch your eye? What do you notice? What did you dig up when you were going through the text? This is the beauty of Bible study. It allows you to sort of dig in with the text and read it and see the sorts of things that come to your mind and that they maybe remind you of other things. So I'm going to give you a moment if you'll pause the video. If not, just hang on for a couple of seconds and we'll be ready to carry on with our study. Okay. So first off, and if you pause the video, welcome back. If not, welcome back a little bit shorter of a period of time. Um, what I always want to notice when I go through a text is how is it written? What's the structure, right? How is it set up? We want to know what do we want to find in which section. Here's kind of how the chapter breaks down. In the first 10 verses, you have the announcement that God is going to deliver his people. In the announcement, you have the description of the reason why in this metaphor of being a shepherd and sheep that God uses. Why is it that the sheep of Israel need deliverance? It's because of their shepherds. In the first 6 verses, you have found, hopefully, a description of these wicked shepherds. It says there in that section, should not shepherds feed the sheep? And this is the English Standard Version I'm reading from. In contrast to what they ought to be doing, the Bible goes on to say, you eat the fat, you clothe yourselves with the wool, you slaughter the fat ones, but you do not feed the sheep. Israel's shepherds, or in this case, Israel's leaders, prophets, priests, rulers, whomever they might be, they have, instead of been providing for Israel, providing for the individual members, doing what's best for them like a good shepherd should, they have been taking advantage of them. They have been profiting rather than providing for the people. And you can see there beginning in verse 7, because of this indictment that's leveled against them, which of course coming from the Lord, there's no uncertainty to this. This is what has been happening. The sheep, as it says there in verses 5 and 6, are scattered over all the face of the earth. Because of that, in verse 7, God says, therefore, you shepherds, hear the word of the Lord. As I live, declares the Lord God, surely because my sheep have become a prey, and my sheep have become food for all the wild beasts since there was no shepherd, and because my shepherds have not searched for my sheep, but the shepherds have fed themselves and have not fed my sheep, therefore you shepherds hear the word of the Lord. Thus says the Lord God, behold, I am against the shepherds, and I will require my sheep at their hand, and put a stop to their feeding the sheep. God comes down and in the most, it sounds a little repetitive, but in the most clear, absolute way possible, God says, I am putting a stop to this. My sheep Israel, my people Israel, have been mistreated long enough. And he himself is coming to deliver them from these wicked rulers. The theme of God himself coming is strong in this section. Besides the fact that you might have noticed God keeps referring to them as my sheep. There's a very personal connection God demonstrates with Israel. But in verse 11, it says even more strongly, not just I am going to come for my sheep, but I myself will search for my sheep. It's more than just I'm going to do this and sort of it will be accomplished because I say so. It is I am coming personally, powerfully, in a really intimate fashion to deliver my people. He's very much describing himself as if he was going to be there in person to do this. And in so doing, in delivering them, he's going to undo the wrongs that have been done to them. Give you a quick example. Instead of eating the fat ones and slaughtering them and not feeding the sheep, it says there in this section from 11 to 26, I will feed them on the mountains of Israel, right? I will rescue them. Instead of them being scattered in the first 6 verses, God is going to bring them out from the peoples and gather them from the countries and bring them to their own land. But he highlights another problem also in verses 17 to 24. It's not merely that just Israel's leaders have become corrupt, but within Israel themselves, within the flock, there are sheep that are not caring for other sheep. He says in verse 17, behold, I judge between sheep and sheep, between rams and male goats. So not I judge between sheep and rulers, but I judge between sheep and sheep. So this is more of a horizontal sort of relationship. He says in this shepherd sheep metaphor, is it not enough for you to feed on the good pasture that you must tread down with your feet the rest of your pasture? And he goes on in that same section that you must muddy the rest of the water with your feet. He not only goes after the leaders which have failed to provide and have left Israel scattered without a shepherd, he goes after the sheep that have mistreated other sheep as well. And he says here in this section, like a good shepherd will, verses 20 through 24, he will separate good sheep from bad sheep. But there's something even more telling in this section, and you don't see it in the outline that's on screen. Towards the latter part of that section, verses 23, 24, in that area, God says something beautiful. He says, and I will set up over them one shepherd, my servant David, and he shall feed them. He shall feed them and be their shepherd. And I, the Lord, will be their God, and my servant David will be prince among them. I am the Lord, I have spoken. Now, this comes as a bit of a surprise in the chapter. God repeatedly says, I myself am coming. I am coming to deliver my sheep, as it says often. But then he says, I'm going to set over them a shepherd, my servant David. Now, in Ezekiel's time, David's been dead for a long time at this point. And so David would not be indicative of, David personally, as in the David, King David, but a person from David's line. It seems from this section, a royal figure, a prince, and a servant of God identified as someone who would come from David. We'll talk more about that in just a moment. In the last section, 25 through 31, the end result of this deliverance is made clear. God declares he will deliver them. He shows how he will deliver them, kind of the nature of it. And then at the end, he shows what is the goal of this deliverance. What is it that God's going to accomplish? Notably, in verse 25, it says, I will make with them a covenant of peace. Now, this is Israel who exists by way of a covenant, by way of this agreement God has made with them. You remember beginning in Mount Sinai, it's described in the book of Exodus and redescribed in Deuteronomy. God is saying, I'm going to make with them a covenant of peace. So there's this new covenant coming along, this new promise or agreement between God and man that he is going to deliver them, save them, be a security to them. There's a line I love in this section. The ESV says, so that they may dwell securely in the wilderness and sleep in the woods. It's a beautiful description in this sheep metaphor that the sheep are going to sleep in the woods. That's not where sheep are supposed to be. That's where all the wild, dangerous things are. And yet God says, when I'm done delivering my people, they will be so secure, they will be so blessed, they will be so safe that they could sleep even in the woods, and nothing shall touch them. There'll be no more prey to the nations, it says here in this section. They shall dwell securely, and none shall make them afraid. And at the end of all this, in verse 31, two things will become apparent. It says, they shall know that I am the Lord their God with them. Now, that's an important phrase if you've been following our study through Ezekiel. You know that God says often, they shall know that I am the Lord. And it's often sort of the final hammer blow on it and on a message of judgment. It is this final affirmation. When I am done judging, destroying all these things, then they will know that I am the Lord. In this section, it has a beautiful tag at the end. I am their Lord, their God, with them. It's not they will know that I am God because I have judged and destroyed, although that's certainly the case. They will know that I am the Lord, their God, and I am with them. Beautiful. Just, I love that, the way that phrase is shifted. And then you see there in verse 31, you are my sheep, human sheep of my pasture. So God makes it very clear. He's talking about Israel and using this shepherd sheep metaphor to sort of structure all of this. Okay, I've talked a lot, and this is the unfortunate thing about this sort of circumstance is that I don't get to hear the feedback. That's what's wonderful about being in our classes, and hopefully you're able to hear some of that on our videos. But I got to press on. We'll be here for 3 hours. I've said this before. You'll notice that in this section, you'll see the phrase "my sheep," at least in this version, repeated some dozen times. Very important to that. This section also would remind us of the blessings for obedience that are found in the covenant promises, specifically Leviticus 26, the good things that are going to happen because of their obedience. God is really, in a sense, giving this back to them, something they forsook because of their sins. This is a metaphor. Because it's metaphorical doesn't mean we need to take it any less seriously. We need to understand it's a poetic description. Okay, Israel, the people are not literally going to sleep in the woods. Woods are kind of hard to come by in that part of the world. But in the description, we need to understand it is serious and it is true what God's going to do for them, although it's poetically described. In verses 1 through 6, the shepherds really, in a sense, become the wolves. Instead of being the ones who defend from the danger, they have become the danger themselves. And so God says, I am delivering my people from you. I mentioned the I myself section. It's more emphatic than just I'm coming. It's I, me, I myself am going to come. There's a strength to that. In verse 12, there is a reference to a day of clouds and thick darkness. Again, poetic. This doesn't mean that it's going to be cloudy on the day that this happens. It's a description of bad times, doom, despair, gloom. You see this type of language used in apocalyptic sections throughout the Old Testament. And again, it's repeated in the New Testament often. Days that are so bad that the sun, moon, and stars fall from the sky. It's not literal. It's a description of, as Chicken Little would put it, the sky is falling, right? Everything is going terribly. And you see that in this section. I put a note from there. Okay, interpretation time. Now that we've sort of had our chance to go through the text, I'm going to pause here for just a moment. If you're following along with us, I'll give you a moment. In this reading through of the section, we want to think about what would this have meant to the original audience. Remember, the Bible wasn't written directly to us in that we were the original audience. It was written for us and for our learning, as is made clear. But when we interpret the Bible, we want to think first about what would they have done with this? What message would have been clear to them? That will then help us understand what we're to do with it. Okay. So if you're following along with us and you'd like to, I'll pause, take a couple of seconds, read through the section, think more about what this text would have meant to the people who heard it for the first time, either the Jews in Babylon or the returned Jews who would have read this for the first time. Okay. Oop, my apologies. I can't get away from distractions. Okay. So, some things that I think a hearer of Ezekiel's original message or a reader of this text for the first time should have come away with. Number one, in this section of deliverance, it's clear that God has not abandoned his people. Right? That's something that an Israelite could have very easily been swayed into thinking, and kind of looking at their current predicament, be easy to do so. They are literally in Babylonian exile. They are not in Israel. They've been cast out of their land for their sins. And so there's this, and especially if you're following Ezekiel so far, it hasn't exactly been rainbows and sunshine. It's been, you've been terrible, you've been faithless to me, so I am casting you out from your land, and you get to go live in Babylon. It's easy to begin to believe that, well, God has just left us here to rot. And the covenant's over, the land is gone, it's all doom and gloom. This chapter resets that view. And it reiterates, one, God's faithfulness to his covenant promise, that he would not forsake his people, right? Which is a big one. But it reminds them that God has not abandoned them and that blessings are coming. Blessings don't merely mean we're going to go home and everything's going to be great. There is a negative side to this blessing in that God's not only going to give them what is good, he's going to excise what is bad. He's going to remove and deal with those wicked leaders, priests, prophets, and so on. He's going to deal with the problem horizontally of Israelites dealing poorly with other Israelites, mistreating them. He's coming to deliver them, in a sense, from themselves, but also from the nations around them. So, in all of these senses, God has not abandoned his people. In that same line of thinking, the fact that God hasn't abandoned them also means that God's not going to tolerate when they are mistreated by either their rulers or by one another or their peers. It doesn't matter whether a person was wealthy or powerful or influential or whatever adjective you want to put on them. Prophet, priest, or king, God's not going to deal with his people being mistreated any longer. He is coming to right the wrongs, to provide justice and deliverance to his people. That would have been a message of great hope to some of those oppressed individuals, right? God is going to set things right. Strong emphasis in this section. On the other side of this, if you're hearing this from the leadership perspective, from the perspective of the prophets, priests, or rulers, whoever they might, governors, I don't know if they had mayors, but maybe at some point they would, right? If you're in a leadership position, what a wake-up call this is. To just totally reset the way you look at Israel, the way you look at the people you care for. Perhaps there was a good leader that looked at this and saw it as, okay, I don't need to be wrong. But if you are a leader that is not in the right place, it is a strong reminder that leadership means caring for and not profiting from your flock. You, as a servant, are there for their benefit. They do not serve for your benefit. And it's a temptation that the powerful have to take a little off the top, to profit instead of provide. Again, this would have been the strongest warning for that. Finally, there's the Messiah message. There's the message of this: God's going to send a shepherd, and he's going to be a very special person. I don't believe, let me look back through the section. I don't believe the word anointed is used there. No, it's not. At least not that I can see. But surely they would have identified this figure in verses 23 through 24 as the Messiah. The writings of Isaiah had been around a long time by this point, and they clearly pointed, like I note here in Isaiah 9, they note that a person is coming who would be identified, as it says there, as a Prince of Peace, someone who's called God himself. And so when the exiles hear this message of a shepherd, the Lord is my shepherd, remember, a shepherd, David, of the line of David, they knew the Messiah would come from David's line, and a prince. The alarm bells would have started going off in their mind. I mean, the good ones. This person is very special. God is going to be faithful to his promise to Abraham that in him all the nations of the earth will be blessed, and his promise of Isaiah 9 to send this deliverer, to send this prince to them. The Israelites hearing this should have picked up on that. Okay. One other thing about that. In 1 Samuel 8, there is the scene where Israel has become fed up with the judge system, the judges leading them. I'm sure Eli has had something to do with this. Samuel's sons, well, the judges as a whole had something to do with it, but Eli and his sons are judged for their wickedness, and the sons of Samuel do not walk in his ways. In fact, that's the problem they bring up in 1 Samuel 8. The Israelites do. And so they desire a king be made for them so that they can be like the nations, and the king can go in and out before them and kind of, win their battles and do this sort of thing. Samuel is very upset by this, and so he brings this to God in 1 Samuel 8. And in 1 Samuel 8 and verse 7, God says something very telling. It is the idea that it's not Samuel who's been rejected as their leader, but God himself. It says this, 1 Samuel 8:7. Obey the voice of the people and all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. Right? It's not that, he says, Samuel, it's not you they're rejecting. They are rejecting me as their leader. In Ezekiel 34, this Israel's leadership is really gone at this point. Zedekiah is gone. There's no real king ruling. The line of David survives, but they don't have any power in that sense of being a king. God is retaking the reins of Israel. He is retaking his role as supreme leader, a role he never abandoned. But with this king system, they sort of abandoned him in that sense. He is reestablishing himself as the one shepherd of Israel and him alone, where he had always was supposed to have been. But in their minds, they followed their kings to their demise, in a sense. Okay. Application. Where are we at? No idea how much time we've spent. Okay. We're not going to worry about it. Application time. This is where we take the lessons we've learned in terms of what Israel should have gathered, and we add to that what should we learn, which are going to be some very similar lessons. But then we also tie our text to Jesus. The Old Testament, really as a whole, points squarely to Jesus, and every section within it, in some sense, does that. And it's an emphasis we've tried to make in this study in Ezekiel. How does what we've read connect to Jesus? Some sections are a little tougher to deal with, and some sections are like tonight, where it's just overflowing with connections to Jesus. It's hard to not find a connection to Jesus in this chapter. It's one of those places where it's just rich with references. So I'm going to give you a couple of seconds, read through the section again, and then think about these two questions. How does this connect to Jesus? And you might go find references. And then how does this text apply to us? How does this change how we live our lives as Christians here in 2023? All right, I'll give you a couple of seconds. This is when you pause the video. Don't try to do all that in 2 seconds, okay? All right, let's talk about Jesus. Like I said just a moment ago, there are nearly too many references to count when you start thinking about how does the stuff we read in this chapter connect over to Jesus. It's overflowing with these sorts of things. Here's just the quick one. John chapter 10 is where he really ought to start with this, because Jesus refers to himself as the Good Shepherd. We don't want to miss this section. This is its own Bible study, John chapter 10. But not only does he refer to him as the shepherd, he refers to himself as the door of the sheep. I am the door, John 10 and verse 9. He says in verse 11, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. He goes on to address the hired hands who have not dealt properly with the sheep, which should remind you of tonight's section in Ezekiel. Verse 14, I am the good shepherd. Again, he says he's going to lay down his life and take it up again. There is a reason why in John 10, beginning there in verse 19, I didn't put this in the notes and I should have, that the Jews are really rather upset about this. There's a division among them, it says in verse 19. Verse 20, many of them said, he has a demon and is insane. Why listen to him? Now, why would the Jews be all up in arms because Jesus just called himself the Good Shepherd a few times? They got the reference. They knew Ezekiel 34. They knew good and well that God is the shepherd of Ezekiel 34. And furthermore, that God was going to send a shepherd from the line. See, they got the references. It's not that they didn't get the point, they got it. They didn't like it, but they understood what Jesus was saying. And they understood that Jesus referred to all those who came before him as thieves and robbers, the leadership of Israel. They were the thieves and robbers. All those who came before that were the bad shepherds. Jesus shows up and he says, I am the good shepherd. They would have gotten that. And that's why they were so upset with this. Anyway, incredibly rich section of text. One thing that I noticed in just thinking more about this connections to Jesus, Matthew's gospel as a whole, I may be wrong on this, and if I am, please let me know somehow. I believe he has more references, Matthew does, to the shepherd sheep idea than any of the other gospels. And this, I don't know if this is all of them, but these are the highlights. In John 10 and verse 12, the 12 disciples at this point, they are sent to the, quote, lost sheep of the house of Israel. Now, that would be a really common way of referring to Israel, but it's interesting that the shepherd just referred to Israel as lost sheep. Same thing as Ezekiel 34. There's Jesus' comment to the Syrophoenician woman, I believe it's the Syrophoenician woman, in Matthew chapter 15, there in verse 24. In this context, he says to her, or the Canaanite woman, it says in the ESV, verse 24, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So not only did he send his disciples in Matthew 10, in this conversation with this Canaanite woman, he says, this is who I was sent to, the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Earlier in Matthew 9, 36 through 38, Jesus sees the crowds and he notes that he has compassion on them, the text says, because they are like, quote, sheep without a shepherd. It says in 36, they were harassed and helpless, just like the sheep of Ezekiel 34, who are scattered, who are lost and without food and without the water that they need so badly. Of course, there's Matthew 18:12. Jesus tells the parable about the 99 who are lost and going and finding the one lost sheep. Add this to the way, Jesus spoke with Peter post-resurrection in John 21. John 21, beginning there in verse 15, you remember Peter is kind of being brought back into the fold. Again, shepherd language. And Jesus poses to him a series of questions. Peter, do you love me? Peter affirms that, yes, he does. And then Jesus says, feed my lambs. Interesting. He asked him the same question again in the verses that follow. Do you love me? Yes. Tend my sheep. Love my sheep. Jesus keeps referring to his people as sheep, just the same way that God referred to his people in Ezekiel 34 as sheep. Of course, move on past the Gospels. The Hebrew writer would squarely identify Jesus as the great shepherd of the sheep, Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 30. This same Peter, whom Jesus has a conversation with in John 21, recognizes later in 1 Peter 5:4 that Jesus is the chief shepherd. So, again, this isn't all of them, but it's one of those sections where Jesus is the guy. He is the good shepherd that's been looked for in Ezekiel 34. John, again, in Revelation 7:17, says the Lamb will be their shepherd. Or I've skipped a few words. The Lamb, and it later on says, will be their shepherd. In terms of applications to us, clearly, the shepherds of local congregations, shepherd being another way to describe an elder of a local congregation. If you want to look at Peter's version of this is 1 Peter 5. He says to them, so I exhort the elders among you, as a fellow elder and as a witness of the sufferings of Christ, as well as a partaker in the glory that is to be revealed, shepherd the flock of God that is among you. Again, shepherd language, obviously. Exercising oversight, not under compulsion, but willingly, as God would have you, not for shameful gain, but eagerly, not domineering over those in your charge, but being examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the unfading crown of glory. You might have noticed verse 3, not domineering over those in your flock. This was the accusation made against the shepherds in Ezekiel 34, that they were ruling roughly and harshly with their charges. The shepherds of local churches are not to lead in that way. They are to do as Jesus told Peter, feed, tend, care for the sheep in that sense. Of course, there's also Paul's conversation with the Ephesian elders in Acts 20, where he uses much the same language. Not as a shepherd, but shepherds of local congregations are expected to lead their sheep the same way God would lead them, the same way Jesus would lead them, with care, with concern, with sacrificial love, looking out for what's best for them, not merely making them happy, but making them better as Christians, and so on. Robert Harkrider, in his study book on Ezekiel, had this to say, and I thought it was very good. Jesus is the shepherd of our souls. We have confidence because of his preeminence and power. If Jesus is the chief shepherd, and he is, then our confidence is not in our ability to be perfect sheep. If we could be perfect sheep, what need would we have for a shepherd? What need would we have for someone to guide us, correct us, care for us, bring us back from those places in which we get ourselves stuck? Our confidence is not in ourselves. It is in the abilities and the actions of our shepherd. In John 10, I put this in verse 14. I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. It is the sacrifice of Jesus that enables all of the promises of Jesus to be fulfilled. It is in that we must put our confidence. It is not in our ability to be perfect sheep. It is in our ability to know the voice of the Master, to serve him with our every waking moment, and to trust that he and he alone can save us. That is our confidence as sheep. We trust the shepherd, and as such, we follow him. Makes you wonder, doesn't it? Do I treat people the way Jesus would treat them as the shepherd? Or do I treat people more like Israel's leaders treated Israel? Do I treat other people as a means to profit from them? As a means to just get something from them, and when I'm done getting what I need, I discard them until they're needed later? Or am I the person providing for what is needed, doing what is best? That sacrificial sort of love, that agape love, as it's called sometimes. Am I truly serving and laying down myself in imitation of Jesus laying down his life for the sheep? It's a really convicting thought to have. Do I treat others, or do I help myself to others, or do I help others? When it comes to the leadership of the shepherd, it has to be trusted completely. This is the thought in Psalm 23. Remember verse 4, they, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. There is a leading, or Jesus is leading us. And if we're unwilling to follow and trust his leadership, then what good is it to have him as a shepherd? If I'm unwilling to follow him, I can get lost right by myself. But when we commit to having Jesus as our Lord as well as our Savior, we commit to following him wherever he goes, to do whatever he says, and to trust that no matter what happens, or no matter where the path he sets for us goes, even if it is through the valley of darkness, we must trust that he will deliver us. And no matter what happens, that he is faithful to his promises. I have to learn to trust the shepherd in this way. Finally, there was a line. Oh, I mentioned the sheep in the wood thing, or the sleeping in the woods thing already. There is a line in this text, and it describes in Ezekiel 34, God says here, when I break the bars of their yoke and deliver them. It just reminded me so much of what Jesus said he was going to do in Matthew 11 and verse 28. Jesus says, come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Sounds very much like, hey, tired sheep, come here, I will take you somewhere safe. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. It is in Jesus that the yoke of sin and death and despair and fear, all of those are broken. And it is in Jesus that we receive a gentle yoke. We receive a burden that is light. We receive salvation from him. It's a beautiful connection between the salvation God would bring Israel and the salvation God or Jesus would bring his church. Finally, and I won't take a pause here because by now, if you're ready to take a pause, you'll take one when you get ready. In the last section, I always try to leave space to think about where might this connect elsewhere. Maybe there's not a connection specifically to Jesus, but there's a connection to something else in Scripture you've heard before, an idea, a thought, a scene, whatever you want to think about it. This is just the section in our study where we want to note other parts of the Bible that might connect and help us in our understanding of this. And the only one that I supplied during our study that came to mind at that time, I'm sure more will come to mind as more study is made. But in Genesis 48, Jacob says something interesting. Jacob's at the end of his life in Genesis 48, and he's preparing to bless his sons. Or in this context, he's preparing to bless Ephraim and Manasseh, the sons of Jacob, the sons of Joseph. And as a part of the blessing, he says this. This is Genesis 49:15. And he blessed Joseph and said, "The God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked," here's the line, "the God who has been my shepherd all my life long to this day." Now again, Jacob isn't literally a sheep, God isn't literally a shepherd. But that relationship of God has been the one who is leading me, providing for me, caring for me. This is the God who has saved me at every turn. It's the same God before whom Abraham and Isaac walked. And Jacob in this section is affirming, he has been my God too. Would that you and I could say such a thing about God. Would that we, at the end of our life, could look at our children and even our children's children and say, God has been my shepherd all my life to this day. The only way that's possible is if we decide today that God is my shepherd. If we decide that today I will follow him, I will follow Christ wherever he goes. It only happens if we decide today I will trust that God will provide for me and that he will care for me. He will deliver me not just from want, but from sin and death. It only happens if we decide today to follow him with our whole heart. I hope the study's been profitable for you. I hope you've gotten some things from this study that would cause you to think, cause you to reconsider, cause you to think more about God and his being a shepherd for you. Lord willing, next Wednesday, or this upcoming Wednesday, should be the 9th, if I've looked at it right. This Wednesday, we will continue our study of Ezekiel, looking more closely at, as it says there, 35:1 through 36:15. This is one of those places where I think you get a bad chapter break. You do get two separate sections, so we're going to do two sections at one time. But they're both described in this mountain sort of language. We're going to get an oracle against Edom, the long relative and enemy of Israel, and then a oracle to Israel describing, actually not to Israel as a person, but to the land of Israel, which is a fascinating section to read. I hope you'll spend some time with it. If you're preparing to be with us in person, the way you do that is you go through that section just the same way as we went through it together tonight. Read it to see what's there, see what structure is there. Read it to see next, what did it mean to those who heard it first? And then think more about, what does it mean to me and how does it connect to Jesus? We look forward to seeing you in person, Lord willing, and thank you for your time tonight.